Sometimes the hardest word to say is not love, it's no. Not because you don't mean it, not because you're confused, not because you're trying to be difficult. It feels hard because somewhere along the way, a lot of people learned that protecting their peace might cost them connection. So even when the answer is clear, the body hesitates, the chest tightens, the mind starts negotiating, and a simple boundary starts to feel like an act of harm. If that feels familiar, pull up a chair. Welcome to Wisdom from the Porch. I'm GP. This is Wisdom from the Porch. Today on the porch, we remember something simple. Protecting your peace is not the same thing as punishing somebody else. There are people who can say no quickly and move on with their day. And then there are people who say no and feel it in their body for hours, sometimes days. Not because they lack conviction, but because no does not register as a neutral word. It registers as risk. Risk of disappointing somebody. Risk of being misunderstood. Risk of seeming selfish. Risk of changing the temperature in a relationship. For a lot of people, no does not feel like a clean decision. It feels like an emotional detonation. Even a respectful boundary can feel internally like rejection, betrayal, or abandonment. That's why so many people say yes when they're already tired. Yes when they're overloaded. Yes when they already know the cost will be too high. Because the immediate discomfort of saying no can feel heavier than the long-term damage of abandoning yourself. That's the trap. And it's a quiet trap, because from the outside it can look generous, reliable, loving, easygoing. But inside, it often feels like slow erosion. A forced yes usually carries a hidden bargain. The bargain sounds something like this. I'll overextend myself so nobody has to feel disappointed. I'll betray my own limits so the moment stays smooth. I'll keep the peace, even if I have to lose mine. That's a painful bargain, because it teaches you that your discomfort is the acceptable cost of everyone else's comfort. And after enough repetition, that pattern starts to feel normal. You start thinking that it's just what being caring looks like. This is what being mature looks like. This is what being dependable looks like. But there's a difference between love and self-erasure. There's a difference between generosity and chronic self-abandonment. And there's a difference between support and over-functioning. If every relationship gets your access, your availability, your labor, your emotional flexibility, and your silence about your own needs, that's not health. That's overexposure. And over time, the cost shows up. It shows up as resentment, as fatigue. It shows up as irritability with people you actually care about. It shows up as numbness. Sometimes it even shows up as confusion, because you can feel yourself getting drained, but you can't point to one dramatic cause. It's not always one dramatic cause. Sometimes it's death by 1,000 reluctant yeses. One of the most important things to understand is this. Guilt is a feeling. It's not always a verdict. Sometimes guilt is useful. Sometimes it alerts you that you acted out of alignment with your values. But sometimes guilt shows up because you're doing something new, something healthier, something that disrupts an old pattern. And when that happens, guilt can impersonate wisdom. It can sound incredibly convincing. It says, "You're being mean. You're letting people down. You are making too much of your needs. You should be able to handle this. You are overreacting." But not every guilt feeling means you're doing something wrong. Sometimes it means you're stepping outside a role that kept you overextended. If your identity has been built around being the one who's always come through, always absorbs, always says yes, always soothes it over, then any boundary will feel unnatural at first. Not because it's unhealthy, because it interrupts a pattern. That discomfort does not automatically mean stop. Sometimes it means stay. Stay long enough to find out whether the guilt is actually grief. Grief that can no longer keep performing endless availability. Grief that a version of you who survived by pleasing is finally being asked to rest. A healthy no is not an attack. It's information. It tells the body about your capacity. It tells the truth about your limits. It tells the truth about what you can give without quietly resenting the cost. And the truth is kind, even when it's inconvenient. A clear no prevents a dishonest yes. It prevents half-hearted presence. It prevents burnout disguised as loyalty. It prevents the kind of help that looks supportive on the surface, but leaves you feeling depleted and distant underneath. A healthy no also creates clarity in relationships. It lets people know where you end and where they begin. That matters. Because without boundaries, closeness gets blurry. Responsibility gets blurry. Expectations get blurry. And eventually resentment starts trying to do the work that honesty should have done much earlier. A boundary is not a wall against love. It's structure for love. It makes trust possible because people no longer have to guess. It makes your yes more meaningful because it is no longer automatic. It makes your care more sustainable because it's not being extracted from exhaustion. That changes the quality of your relationships. Not overnight, but deeply. A lot of people think the goal is to learn how to say no perfectly. But perfection is not the goal. Honesty is. Clarity is. Self-respect is. You don't need a speech. You don't need a courtroom defense. You don't need to make your exhaustion sound respectable enough to be believed. Sometimes the healthiest no is simple. I can't do that this week. I'm not available for that. I need to pass. I don't have the capacity right now. That kind of language can feel too short when you're used to cushioning everything. But short does not mean cruel. Short can mean clean. And clean matters because over-explaining often happens when you're still trying to manage the other person's feelings. You're not just communicating a boundary, you're trying to make the boundary painless. Most of the time that doesn't work. It just leaves you more tangled. Now, kindness still matters. Tone matters. Timing matters. Care matters. But kindness does not require self-betrayal. You can be warm and still be clear. You can be compassionate and still be unavailable. You can love someone and still say no. The part that often gets overlooked is what happens after you say no. That's where many people panic. Because after the boundary comes the silence, the pause, the waiting, the possibility that someone may be disappointed, the temptation to go back and fix it, soften it, reverse it, offer more than you meant to give. That moment matters because it teaches your nervous system whether you're allowed to hold the line. If you rush back in every time discomfort appears, your body learns that boundaries are dangerous and must be undone. But if you stay present and let the discomfort rise and fall without scrambling to erase it, something shifts. You start learning that another person's disappointment is survivable. You start learning that tension is not the same thing as harm. You start learning that you can stay loving without becoming endlessly available. That's real growth. Not becoming cold, not becoming rigid, not becoming indifferent, just becoming honest enough to stop calling self-abandonment kindness. So if saying no feels harsh to you, that doesn't mean you're weak. It doesn't mean you're doing boundaries wrong. It may simply mean you're learning a new relationship with your own worth. One where your needs are not an interruption. One where your capacity matters too. One where peace is not something you earn by overextending yourself. Your no does not make you unkind. Sometimes it's the most honest kindness available. Because every real boundary says the same quiet thing. I want to stay whole enough to show up truthfully. If today's episode gave language to something you've been carrying, share it with somebody who needs permission to protect their peace. Subscribe, leave a comment, and let me know what boundary you're learning to stop apologizing for. And on this porch, we remember something simple. Protecting your peace is not the same thing as punishing someone else. This episode was designed to help you separate guilt from truth, so you can set healthier boundaries without confusing self-respect for harm. Thank you to Cloud Microphones for supporting these conversations. This has been Wisdom from the Porch. I'm GP. You're always welcome on the porch.